It's an honor for me. I'm a PhD student from Tel-Aviv University, and it's an honor for me to talk about these two professors. And today I'm going to talk about the free movement, and I think it's not working, so I'll present. And the question, yeah, okay. So I'm going to talk about the role of trade unions in shaping inter-European migration, and I'm going to talk about I'm going to talk about it by analyzing patterns of East EU migration to Sweden and the UK. Now, in 2004, as we spoke earlier, the old EU 15 Western member states approved the accession of new member states, most of them from former East Europe or Central Europe. And since they were concerned about gaps between the old and new member state, the accession agreement allowed the transitional restrictions, which means that the member states, the old member states, the Western member states, could suspend the free movement of the new EU citizen for up to 7 years. Most EU 15 Western member states did take this option of transitional restriction, with the exception of 3, which were Sweden, the UK, and Ireland. 10 or 12 years later, when we look at the Polish diaspora, which usually in Europe are the biggest diasporas, in Sweden there are only about 48,000 Polish workers. In the UK, the same year, according to the Eurostat, this was the number. The Office of National Statistics in the UK argued that the numbers are even higher, and this Office of National Statistics also, you can see here in the graph, the red one and the blue one are the EU 8 and EU 15, and it's rising from 2004 until 2016. So my question that I'm going to talk about it now is what explains these differences between Sweden and the UK. I won't go through theories of international migration. There are many explanations to explain what shaped international migration, what generated it, what are the consequences of it. I would just want to mention one leading theory, which is the push-pull factor. It deals with what pushes people out of the country and what pulls them to a certain destination. Why do they leave a country? Why do they want to enter a certain country? And I will use it later in my arguments. And when we talk about the EU migration, usually it's basically 2 general types of immigration in the EU. The first is the inter-EU migration. It's between the member states, in the internal borders of the EU. The other is what we call TCNs. It's third country nationals. It's immigrants from the rest of the world to into Europe. Most of the literature in the last decades focused on this type of immigration, and I won't go through all the literature about define it as an era of crisis in Europe, the monetary crisis, the immigration or refugees crisis, the rise of Islam, terror, extreme right, all of which challenges the EU solidarity and the EU leadership. Today I'm going to talk about the other type of immigration in Europe, inter-EU migration, which is grounded in 2 main treaties. The first is the Schengen Treaty that abolished the border control between European countries, and I'm sure all of you know that not all EU member states are part of the Schengen zone, and there are countries that are not EU members, like Norway and Switzerland. The other one is the Maastricht Treaty, which formed the EU as we know it today. And let's go again to the 4 freedoms. And I'm going to talk also about the freedom of persons, the right of EU citizens and their family members to move and reside freely within the EU. And I'm going to ask today how free it truly is. So we have the freedom of movement. We have new member states. Here they are. We have two countries that from the beginning allow free movement, allegedly free movement. And as we saw earlier, in the UK there are a lot of East European immigrants, while in Sweden not so much. Although Sweden must be a very good pull destination, it's a strong economy, generous welfare systems. So the questions I want to ask is, why so many EU immigrants move to the UK? And why do the Brits see them as a threat to the extent of voting leave the EU? So when we talk about immigration within the EU, one explanation might be geography. And we know that neighboring country, usually there are big movement of people between them. But in our case, this is not the case. So both countries are far from the new member states. Language might be a very good explanation. I guess all of you can read this. I don't know.
Välkommen till Sverige.
Oh my God. Okay. This might also be a very good reason to move the UK. However, you are Swedish?
I can speak Norwegian.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I have no more words.
It's the food, the British food.
The weather.
The food.
Yeah, but you see the Swedish princess.
The crown princess of Sweden.
Yeah, Sophia. So our go again to work. EU migration is labor migration, and I'm going to literature that refer to work as a leading pull factor. This literature argue that the decision of people to go to a certain country, it's not because of the great culture or the generous welfare systems or the high quality of life, but the probability of getting a job. Therefore, and it's very reasonable because when we look at the unemployment rates in Poland in 2003, before the enlargement, these were the rates in Poland compared to the Sweden and the UK. So my argument is that to understand the different patterns of EU aid migration in Sweden and the UK, we should focus on the national labor markets in each country and on the institutions and regulations that shape it. And I have two hypotheses, two arguments. The access of EU aid workers to national labor markets is affected by A, the status of the trade union, and B, the national labor market regulation regarding TCN. TCN, remember, third country nationals. I do it by comparative analysis of labor market regulation and institution and immigration policies, and by in-depth interview that I conducted in London, in Stockholm and in London with the former leading ministers. And let's start with my first argument, the role of trade union. I argue that national labor markets that are strongly regulated and institutionalized through strong trade unions are less open to EU aid workers. And the first thing we have to take in mind, to bear in mind when we talk about trade unions in Europe, that all over Europe there is a decline in membership in trade unions. Having said that, still in the Scandinavian countries it's still relatively high. This is Sweden, this is the UK. So first thing we have to bear in mind that the status of the trade unions all over Europe is declining. However, I try to see if there is a connection between the rates of membership in trade unions in Europe and inter-European migration. So I compared this data with data on free movement immigration, and you see that there is an opposite correlation in the countries here, Scandinavian countries. The trade unions are relatively strong, while in the countries where there is a high portion of inter-European immigration, the trade unions are relatively weak. I have to say that this data of the free movement refer to all EU movement, not only to West Europeans, but when we look at the largest diasporas of East European countries, of East European diasporas in Western Europe, it's in countries where the trade unions are relatively weak. Italy, Ireland, UK, Spain, and the Netherlands. And just to tell you how it's reflected in the day-to-day life, I want to share with you some of the interviews I made. This is Marita Ulfskog. She was a Minister of Interior and then a Deputy Prime Minister in Sweden. And she told me, we have strong trade unions in Sweden. The social partners are usually very coordinated. People fleeing from violence. There has been a very open borders ideology in practice. When it comes to those who have been coming to Sweden for work, there has been a strong contract between the social partners. Who are the social partners she's talking about? The employers, the unions, and the government. And her colleague Jens Orbach, who was the Minister of Integration, he said the party, the Social Democratic Party, has been, who was in government then, has been more hesitated on labor migration. The trade unions, together with the employers, decided whether there is a lack or a need for people to come here. Okay. Meanwhile, in the other side of the Northern Sea, in the UK, this is what Jackie Smith, she was a Minister of State and Home Secretary, she told me this. In industrial towns in the West Midlands, all of a sudden, in the factories, large number of Polish workers have been brought in by agencies, and it was very noticeable. Poles opened a deli in the middle of the town. In schools, there were suddenly many non-English speakers. And a colleague of her, Ian Austin, who is a current MP, he said suddenly employers were able to use cheaper labor from abroad to undercut wages. So we have in Sweden strong unions, in the UK weak unions, but the numbers I showed you before refer to the percentage of workers that are union members. The status of the unions is shaped also by other factors. And let's look what happened in the 2000s with the two countries. So in both countries, the government was led by a Social Democratic Party. Yeah. In Sweden, it's a traditional or classical social democracy with strong unions, strong welfare state systems, and the social partners triangle system, as we saw earlier. We have to bear in mind that in this year in Britain, it's the third wave type of social democracy, which means that free market is kind of ethos, or this was the leading economic approach those days in the UK, and that means the unions that were already working in the Thatcher time are does not have a strong status in the UK in these years. And to conclude my argument about the effect of the trade unions on EU aid migration, I will quote Marita Ulfskog again. If you are competing, basically she said in Sweden, the best worker get the job and not the cheaper one. Which in England it's the opposite. I'll go through it fast. The other argument is that the access of EU aid workers to national labor markets is affected by TCN labor markets regulation, and I will explain it. To understand that, we have to look first on the type of migration that approved entrance to Sweden in the UK. In Sweden, most of them are humanitarian and family reunification. In the UK, most of them are free movement and work. And this is reflected in the leading immigration policies in the two countries. In the UK, the leading policy is the point-based system, which aims to regulate the access of immigrants to the labor market. In Sweden, the leading policy is the introduction program, which aims to integrate people into the working life. And just in few words, in Sweden, the introduction program, it gives the immigrants Swedish classes, work experience. It's 2 years, it's full-time, and they get gradual payment. Also, employers in Sweden get benefits if they if they hire people from this program. In the UK, the point-based system is just like the green card in the USA and Australia, which you get points according to some categories, and the higher the score you get, the higher your chances to get a job in the UK. So the introduction program aims to integrate immigrants. The points-based system aims to regulate and how it affects the... this is a very important quote, but Tony McNulty, who was the Minister of Immigration, what he told me about this program. We have developed effective mechanism to control immigration, the point-based system and asylum legislation alongside it, but it is all about non-European immigration. These East Europeans was under control. It was under our radar. It is a bit like saying the motorway M25, the time it was built, it was perfect, but now it's not relevant anymore. So, and Lord David Treisman told me the free market condition allow for free movement of people, and we failed to assess the numbers and failed to handle it. Just to conclude, the point-based system allows EU citizens to bypass the criteria for entering to enter the labor force, while the introduction program, EU 8 cannot join it, so they don't have the ticket to the Swedish labor market. And that makes UK pull destination, because it is easy in non-academic words. I would say it's easier for EU 8 workers to get a job in the UK and not in Sweden.
Can you show the Ireland figures
Okay.
for union membership?
I don't have it here.
No, but in the chart for union membership,
Ireland
Ireland is not there in the list.
in there.
It's there, right? Where's Ireland?
I think this is Ireland.
That's Italy. Ireland is
Ireland,
over there in the middle.
After the
So the Irish one is relatively low as well, right? So
And in Ireland also.
There is quite a bit of migration from Eastern
Okay.
Europe to
Yeah, that's the point.
Yeah.
That's the point.
let's leave the question for later, okay? I would